Okay, so now we are working through Arthur Young's great book, The Reflexive Universe. And we're up to chapter 5, which is called The Turn. And so far we have looked at light and its properties, the kingdom of light, let's say, which represents the principle of potentiality. It's sort of, as it were, pregnant with the universe. Light is the fundamental thing. Okay, so now he's going to look briefly at subatomic particles and atoms. But first, this idea of the turn. So the turn is the point then in his V-shaped arc. It's the tip of it, which corresponds to molecules, as it goes from light to subatomic particles to atoms, and then the principle of combination, which is molecules. Atoms are the principle of identity. Subatomic particles is the principle of substance. So it moves from potential to substance, then to identity, then to combination, and then with plants to growth, with animals to mobility, with humans to dominion. Those are the 7 principles, and they're recapitulated on each of the levels except for the subatomic particles, which I guess he couldn't figure out how to plug in things like quarks and so forth. But so he left that blank. But otherwise, the other 6 levels each recapitulate these 7 principles. Now, the turn then is the point at which life emerges from molecules, and he has this idea here, which I, of course, completely disagree with, that life at a certain point at the molecular level simply becomes all of a sudden self-organizing, and then now that's the turn, because the principle of control comes in now, and life begins to make its own decisions about producing molecules. I don't see how it can do that accidentally unless spiritual beings from the other side are involved in this process. Here we get into a problem that's it's somewhat similar to Aurobindo's idea. He too ran into a problem accounting for the emergence of life from matter as just a kind of miracle, just a kind of, matter's already pregnant with life. No, it isn't. It is not pregnant with life. And Aurobindo should know better, because his whole philosophy is based on other beings. He knows very well, which he calls divas, that there are spiritual beings. And he did leave room, though, to give him credit for the possibility that maybe it was a divine intervention, which it had to have been. The first living things are bacteria. There is some indirect evidence that they may go back to 4.3 billion years ago in the Hadean, actually, before the late heavy bombardment that brought water and created the oceans, which took place between about 4.1 billion and 3.8 billion years ago. And then supposedly, so once the oceans have formed out of these asteroids bringing water to the Earth, and the molecular fingerprint of water on those asteroids matches the molecular fingerprint of the water on our planet. So we know that's where it came from. And then the earliest fossils of bacteria were dated like 3.4 or 5 billion years ago. But now there's indirect evidence pushing it back to 3.7 and even 3.8, and a vague suspicion that it might be 4.3 actually. So how life could originate without water is beyond my ken, unless it was the case that the late heavy bombardment wasn't late and had been going on all along since the formation of the Earth 4.5 billion years ago, and it's just constantly been bombarded from 4.5 to 3.5 billion years ago, and that there already was water there as far back as 4.3 billion years ago. So, anyways, he has this idea that temperature now is a key thing for life to emerge, because it emerges only in a very narrow range. He says the extremes of temperature are absolute zero is negative 459.4 degrees Fahrenheit, whereas the temperature on the sun is 10,800 degrees Fahrenheit. But life can only exist in a narrow window between, he says, 23 degrees and 221 degrees Fahrenheit. If you put food in the refrigerator, life ceases. It's too cold. That's why we have refrigerators, to kill bacteria and mold and stuff like that. But over 100 degrees, most life tends to cease as well, once you start getting well over 100. But I presume there are bacteria that can survive at 200 degrees, because that's the range that he gives. So that's point number 1 for the turn, is that temperature is absolutely key. Life for him is self-organizing, since he doesn't believe in another world, in an astral plane. That's too bad. And then he gives us a concrete example of the control model that we saw last time. Let's take a look again at that control model. So here it was where we had position at L, and then velocity, which is rate of change, the rate of change of position with respect to time, and then acceleration, which is the rate of change of velocity with respect to time. And then Young added at the top there control, which is the rate of change of acceleration with respect to time. And he gave the paradigm of a person driving a car. That's the control model, which then takes place at this turn. This is the turn. And notice that the arrow is going clockwise in that sequence, whereas let's take a look at, he gives a concrete example now in this chapter of it, and I've taken kind of crappy photographs from my book. I hope you can make them out there, where he says, so imagine a child who burns his hand on the stove, which I did actually as a 2-year-old. I remember it very distinctly. And he says, so the process of he calls it a phase. The child touches the stove. That's one random action there, which is on the left. And note that the arrow here now is going counterclockwise. Pulls his hand away, so that's the unconscious or instinctive reaction there at 2. And then he associates pain with the stove, which is 3, a conscious reaction. And then finally 4, the control issue is him simply avoiding the stove. Now he's learned, and he knows to avoid the stove. So that's a concrete model of control, of human free will. Something happens to you, you react, and your will is free in accordance with how you react. So let's see. There was one more point in this chapter about how there are different laws operating at each of the 4 levels that he talks about, going down to molecules. At the first level of light, there are no laws. So there just simply aren't any. It's the realm of pure freedom. At the second level, that of subatomic particles, there are laws of conservation, such as mass, charge, spin, and algebra is what is used in quantum mechanics, A equals B or A equals negative B. Then at the third level, the level of atoms, we have laws of motion, gravitation, geometry is the mathematics that applies at that level. And then finally at the fourth level, that of molecules, we have the physical, visible universe with boundary conditions, i.e. particulars. 2 bodies cannot occupy the same position at the same time. So it's mutually exclusive of bodies unless they collide and disintegrate, as planets do, for example. The moon was formed when a planet named Theia crashed into it. And then it formed something new. It gave birth to the moon. It was like a marriage. All right, so let's take a look now at the chapter 6, which is on atoms. And so he's going to apply what he calls his process philosophy now to atoms. And of course, here are the first 3 basic atoms: hydrogen, helium, and lithium. And of course, hydrogen is the atom. It was the first atom. It has 1 electron up above there and 1 proton. Very simple. It was made in the Big Bang, came right out of the Big Bang, which is fortunate because, and it makes up 75% of physical matter, hydrogen does, because suns, it's the gasoline that powers suns. So it's a good thing it's abundant as it is. Interesting coincidence in a sort of accidental paradigm that there would be that much hydrogen. It's like the universe knew that it would need it to make stars, to fuse hydrogen together to create helium, and helium together then to create carbon, and then oxygen, and so on, and seed the universe with these elements absolutely necessary for life. And then so there's helium there with 2 electrons and 2 protons, and then we have lithium there where the number increases, 3 and 3. So those are some basic elements. Okay, so now let's take a look at what he does with the periodic table of the elements. It's quite interesting when he applies process philosophy to it. So he looks at the so-called alkali earth metals And I didn't get a full picture of the table of the elements there at the top, but it would be, see the two columns over there on the far left? They're sort of off by themselves. Those are the alkalis, and the first one are simply alkali metals. The second one are the alkali earth metals, and these are the ones that he proceeds to talk about here. So his diagram down in the bottom, he actually starts with helium, though, which isn't in this. Helium is on the first row. Hydrogen and helium make up the first row of the 7 vertical rows of the table of elements. So he grabs helium because helium, he needs it for his example here to come out to 7. But watch what he does there. Helium down below on the left has 2 shells for its electrons, 2 shells. Then as you go down to beryllium, which is next on the chart there, the 2 is recapitulated, and then another 2 is added. Then we go down to the next element. This is going down vertically, magnesium. So the 2 2s are recapitulated, and another 2 is added, and a 6. Then as we go down to calcium, the principle keeps repeating itself. Another 6 plus a 2. And then with strontium, we have a 10 and a 6 and a 2. And then with barium, we have a 10 plus a 6 and a 2. Then finally, with radium, we have a 14 shells plus a 10 and a 6 and a 2. So the point here is that process is cumulative. Each stage includes what went before. 7 stages of process then follow an AAB or a 1-1-2 scheme. Each stage repeating before a new development occurs as it goes down vertically there. Interesting how it transcends the previous element, but includes it, as it were. Transcends but includes. So process is cumulative. So that's the first point to understand about it. And so let's actually look at the table of the elements here. Let's take a look here at the official chart of the table of the elements. So this is the official chart. And the way science divides it, so we have just looked at that second row from the left there that shows beryllium, magnesium, calcium, strontium, barium, and radium going down. And their numbers are there. Note the numbers of electron shells: 4, then 12, then 20, then 38, then 56, then 88. So there's I don't know math well enough to know what the ratios are, but they're not accidental. And that's Jung's whole point here, is that none of this is accidental. So those left 2 rows are normally the alkali metals. The furthest one on the left that starts with hydrogen at the top, those are alkali metals, and then the next row in then are alkali earth metals. Then all those purple metals that you see in the middle there are they're called transition metals. And then off to the right there, where you see the sort of orange and pink elements, those are ordinary metals, as they're called. And then finally, the last 2 rows there, the green row are halogens, and the white row there are noble gases, and they're called noble because they don't consort with the commoners, let's say, because they don't bond with anything else. Helium all the way down, so argon and so forth, they don't bond with anything else. And then the bottom 2 rows are, of course, rare earth metals, and they are radioactive. Those are the radioactive ones. So there's a little over 100 elements, but some of them are artificial because they've been manufactured in laboratories. They have very brief lifespans. So Jung says there's about 100. So some of them, I think he thinks that some of them are spurious. Okay, so now let's take a look then. At how he handles the rows. So we've gone down vertically on one row, it's showing the process theory being cumulative. Now let's go across and plug it in, because there's 7 rows, and he has 7 levels: potential, substance, identity, combination, growth, and mobility. All right, so on that chart there, the first row only consists of hydrogen and helium. That's the realm of potential. it's analogous to light in the hydrogen, especially because, like light, it's extremely abundant and basic, and it's the element from which everything else is made. And then so the second row has to do with substance because it contains carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and these are properties that are absolutely essential for building the human body. So that corresponds to substance. The third row then corresponds to identity in the sense that each of the elements in the third row going across here has its own identity and a special purpose. For example, sodium functions to maintain the sodium-potassium balance in the body. Magnesium is important for chlorophyll molecules in plants so that they can photosynthesize. Aluminum is not present in the body, but he says silicon is important in the shells, of course, of things like diatoms, calamites, and then phosphorus makes the DNA helix. Each helix is a row of phosphorus atoms. And then we have sulfur, which is important as the hook that joins protein chains together. And that makes possible the molecular structure of the proteins. And then finally, chlorine is linked with the sodium-potassium balance. But this represents this third row, the principle of identity. And then so the fourth row, which would represent the principle of combination, let me read the paragraph here where he talks about the fourth row. He says, the fourth row elements also have special functions, but here it would appear that the combining motif is emphasized. And so remember, this corresponds to the fourth molecules. So they're structurally homologous, these levels, which is the level of combination in the macro world. The combining power of iron with the other chemically similar metals in the 10 shell group is important in alloys of steel, which are obtained by addition to iron of chromium, vanadium, cobalt, nickel. Similarly, zinc and copper make the important alloy bronze. Nickel and chromium are used for resistive elements in heaters. For the most part, however, we have to turn to the chemistry of life to discover how the latent potentials of the different rows manifest. For example, in the hemoglobin of the blood, iron combines with oxygen at the lungs, which is given up at the muscles. So that's the row of combination. Now, with regard to the next row, the row of growth, he says, he admits that he can only find one element in the row that corresponds to the principle of growth, and that is iodine, because iodine is necessary for the thyroid gland to function, and the thyroid gland is what regulates growth. And then also in the sixth row, that of mobility, he says the only one he can find there is gold, which is sometimes used in the treatment of arthritis, which then would correspond to the principle of mobility. And then the seventh row, he says chemistry now is transcended by radioactive tracer elements. Perhaps man, with the trail of unnatural pollutants he leaves behind, has some resemblance to these seventh row elements, all of which are radioactive and destructive to their environment, just like human beings are. So this would correspond to the principle of dominion, but the negative aspect of it, the human being polluting the world. And then so finally, let's see here, he plugs this into an arc at the end of the discussion here. And he says, so take a look at this arc that moves from hydrogen, the atom. Binding energy are the things that glue these things together, and then it goes down to the level of iron and then goes up to uranium, and atomic weight increases as it goes. And he says, well, this arc seems rather mild in its gentle contour. It packs a lot of wallop, for the difference between uranium and iron provides the energy release in the atom bomb. In other words, fission. The atom bomb was originally based on splitting uranium atoms, and the difference between hydrogen and iron provides that of the hydrogen bomb, which is based on fusion, just like the sun. The sun fuses hydrogen atoms together to release all of its energy to create helium. Also, he says, iron is displaced to the left because there are more elements in the rows after iron. These factors adjusted, we would have a diagram that resembles the arc, the overall arc of the fall, sinking, capture, and then eventual escape. Everything in Young's model recapitulates the arc, the major arc of the fall, sinking, capture, then release. We would have a diagram that resembles the arc and even suggests the evolution of the heavier elements from iron, still but partially understood, but thought to have occurred before the present sun existed. And so that's how Arthur Young applies his process theory to the periodic table of the elements and the level of atoms. So there's a lot in there and a lot to learn. And the cool thing about Arthur Young is learning as you go along, studying his chapters, learning all these cool particulars about science that you could only otherwise get by reading dry, boring science textbooks that nobody wants to read. So I prefer learning about these kinds of particulars this way, even though Young is more of a materialist than he is a spiritual person. But not totally. It's not like Stephen Hawking, this boring atheist, who would be all the way at one end, Aurobindo and Steiner at the other end. Young is somewhere kind of in between, maybe tilting more in the direction of materialism, but he still does have spiritual ideas. Okay, so we'll leave it there, and next we will look at level number 4, which is the principle of combination, the molecular kingdom, and that's chapter number 7.